Hi everyone, this is the first tutorial of a series of tutorials I will be making that will show you how to make your first game using the Unity engine. And this is made with total beginners in mind. You don't need to know anything about coding or about making games. It's perfectly fine if you're a complete beginner, and I hope you enjoy. So I've already gone ahead and made a new 2D project. As you can see, everything's quite empty. So the first thing we'll do is we'll take a brief look at the Unity engine and how to sort of navigate around it. So the first big window we'll notice here is what's called the scene window, as we can see from the tab right here. Let's take a quick step back from making a game quickly, and let's think of something like a play. Now, if we were making a play, we'll think about what do we need for a play? Well, we need actors, we need props, we need scripts for our actors to follow, and we need a stage to rehearse our play and a stage to actually perform our play. So if we think of it like that, and if we look at our scene view, this is essentially the rehearsal stage, or where we'll actually be building our play, so it will be performed later. So this is the window where we'll be dragging and dropping assets we want to use, the building blocks of our game, and we'll actually build levels and games here. So this is kind of like the workbench. This is where you'll actually be constructing your game. Now, the next window I want to take a look at is the one right beside it, which right here it says game. Now, we'll be greeted with a big blue screen because there's nothing in our scene window yet. So the game window is essentially the stage where we'll actually be performing our play, or in other words, this is the actual preview of our game when it becomes an application. So as you can see, there's nothing we can really do here. I'm clicking, there's nothing we can modify in here. This is strictly a preview of our game. If we want to go back and make a change, we have to go back to the scene window and make our changes here. So the scene window is where we'll be building our game. The game window will be where we'll be viewing and actually playing our game. The next window I want to take a look at is, let's go to the window on the left of the scene window. And as you can see up here, it's called the hierarchy. Now the hierarchy is essentially a list of all the objects you currently have in your scene. So if we go back to the play analogy, we can think of somebody that's having to keep track of all the props, the actors in every scene. This sort of acts like that. It'll keep track of every single object that we put into our game, or rather in this current scene. There are a bit more complicated ways we can actually use the hierarchy, but we'll get into that eventually. The window we'll want to take a look at next is the one below these two, and that we can see is called the project window. Now the project window is essentially a great big folder where we'll be dragging and dropping all the assets we want to use for our game. So if I have a certain sprite I want to use for our player, I would drag and drop it into this big box in the project folder, and then from there I can drag and drop it into our scene window and actually use it. So right next to the project window, we have what's called the console window, and this window will essentially show us any warnings, errors, or debug messages that we may have. And we will be using this soon for debug messages when we're going to start programming, but we don't have to worry about it too much yet. Now the window on the right is what's called the inspector window, as we can see up here. Now, if we haven't clicked on anything yet, then obviously the inspector window will be blank because there's nothing to inspect. So if we actually go into our hierarchy, and if we click on our main camera, you'll notice a bunch of things pop up on the inspector window. And as the name inspector suggests, this will inspect an object and tell us all the properties and behaviors of it. So right away we can see its name is main camera, it has a transform, it has camera. These are what's called components, and we'll be getting into them soon. But that's essentially what the inspector does. We can add new behaviors to objects, make them interactable, and yeah. So now let's actually take a look at making something inside Unity. To make a new object, we have to right-click on the hierarchy, and as you can see, we are given options to create a new object. So we can make a 2D object, 3D object, and a bunch of other things we won't have to worry about just yet. So for now, because this is a 2D project, let's go into 2D object, sprites, and we can pick a shape here. So let's go square. Now, as you can see, it created a square in the scene view, and it also shows up in the hierarchy. And also, it will show up in our game window. Now, if we go back to our scene view, if we click on our square, we can notice we can move it around and manipulate it. If we go back into the game tab, we'll notice that we're actually not able to manipulate this object at all. It's just standing there. So again, to move it, to do anything to it, we have to go into the scene view. Now, back to the inspector, we'll notice that, again, it's filled up with a bunch of properties about this square. And so we can actually play around with this a little bit. So we can rename it to something like Big Cube, I don't know. You can name it whatever you'd like. And then as you can see, we have a property here called the sprite renderer, or a component here called the sprite renderer. And inside this component, we have a bunch of properties we can play around with. So for example, the current sprite it's using is the square sprite. We can change its color. So if we click on the color, we can change it. So we can make it red, we can make it orange, whatever. There's a bunch of other things here. You can flip the sprite, although that won't make a difference because this is a perfect square. And a bunch of other stuff we won't have to worry about yet. But as you can see, there is a big option here called Add Component. And if we so wish, we can add new components to objects and make them behave differently. So if we try playing this for now, as you can see, we can see our square in the game window. I'm going to turn on Maximize on Play so we can see it bigger. And if we press play, pretty much nothing happens. And that's because this is just, well, this is just a single sprite floating in space. If we want to actually add something, let's try making this square fall, like with gravity. So to do that, let's click on our square in the hierarchy, or in the scene window. I just like the hierarchy for some reason. And inside the inspector window, we can notice there's the option for add component. And to add a component, let's click on it, and let's type in rigid body 2D. And as you can see, there's an option here for rigid body 2D. So let's click on that. So what we've essentially done is we've added a new behavior to our square. So now if we press play, something very interesting happens. Our square falls. And that's because this component basically gives objects physics. So if you typed in rigid body, you may notice that there are two options actually. There's rigid body and rigid body 2D. And the one we want to choose, because this is a 2D object, we want to go with a 2D rigid body. So now, as you can see in our inspector window, we now have a rigid body 2D here. And again, we can change a bunch of its properties, and yeah. So there's a bunch of other things we can do with these new components. So let's see. Let's make a little platform for our box to fall on. So to do that, let's go into our hierarchy. Let's right click, 2D object, sprites. Let's go with the square again. And we'll name it ground. You can name it whatever you'd like. It's up to you. So now with our ground, what we want to do is we want to add a component that gives it collision. So that way things won't phase through it. So because this is a square shape or a box shape, we need to use what's called a box collider. So if you go into add component for the ground, make sure you're on the ground object, click on the add component, and type in collider. As you can see, there are a bunch of options for a bunch of different shapes. Because we're working with 2D and this is the shape of a square, otherwise known as a box, we would want to use the box collider 2D. So now, it may be a bit difficult to see, but if we zoom in by scrolling, there's a fine green line that might be a bit difficult to see, but there's a bit of a green line surrounding the square, and that basically indicates there is a collider circling or around the square. So now let's lengthen it a bit so it actually looks a bit like a ground. So on our top left here, we'll notice we have a bunch of tools at our disposal here. What I have right now is what's called the Rect tool. And if you've worked with Google Slides or something like that, you can easily manipulate 2D objects like so. So we can give it a bit of a shape like this. So it's like our ground. There's other ways to do this. On the left of it, there's the Scale tool, which, as the name suggests, it scales things. And that's just another way to do it. We may also notice in the inspector window, we also have a component which we can't actually do too much with it. You may notice when we highlight an object in the inspector window, we have what's called the transform at the top. And the transform essentially keeps track of an object's position, rotation, and scale. So we can actually directly manipulate these values here, or which is what's probably easier, is just manipulate them in the scene. But this will essentially keep track of its current position, rotation, and scale. Great, so let's move our platform in position. So let's just put it here. So now let's try running it first. Now you may notice a slight problem. It doesn't actually collide, the box still just phases through. And that's because we've only given one of these objects a collider. In order for two things to collide and not actually phase through each other, both of these things need to have a collider. So if we go into our original square object and give this one a box collider too, now if we press play, our box should just land on our ground. Nice. And you can fool around with that as well. You can, let's duplicate this square a bunch of times and see what happens. So what I'm using right now is the move tool, which is the second option in the toolbar here. And that basically just lets you move around an object. So if we go back to the game window, yeah, and as you can see, they fall and bump into each other as normal. Cool. So this is something you can play around with. We can build a bit of a bigger arena. Like, for example, we can make, I forgot what those games were called, but let's make like a container, and then let's create a smaller square. Let's rotate it now, which is the third option, and we'll just rotate it in the shape of a diamond or something like that. So we can move this, duplicate it a bunch of times. We can also manipulate multiple objects at once. So as you can see in the hierarchy how it's keeping track of all the objects that are currently in the scene, if we hold shift and then click an object, as you can see, we've selected multiple objects. So we can move all of them at, oh my goodness, I did not mean to get those. We can move them around, and we can, what I was trying to do is scale them smaller. So you can manipulate them in big groups like that. So let's move these cubes up as well. And let's see what happens. And if you look at that, they should fall like that. All right, so that basically concludes this tutorial. So we took a look at how the Unity engine works. We got to play around with physics a little bit. We got to first, most importantly, actually place objects in our scene. What you can do now is you can play around more with these properties. For example, you can change the mass, you can give it no gravity, play around with it and see what happens. You can also try using different objects. So I used a square in this case. You can also create a bunch of other things like a circle, capsule, isometric diamond, something like that. But for the most part, just try experimenting with what you've currently been given. So like take a look at what other components there are and just have fun with it, play around with it a bit. And yeah, that essentially concludes this tutorial. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you for the next one.